Let me say that I don't consider myself to be an agricultural specialist. I mean, apart from being essentially a research administrator, we look at issues from the point of view of development strategy, and certainly NCAER has been working a lot about India's response and preparation for globalization. So I'm going to talk at a relatively broad level and not really as a specialist. And the way I want to formulate the question to be then filled in by my much more better informed and erudite colleagues is, how did we at NCAER at least see agricultural policy before the recent spike? How do we see the sources of that spike? And in what ways, if at all, does that change our sense of what India should be doing for itself? Now, the starting point is, of course, that India is a country that has been very concerned, and rightly concerned, with issues of food security. And I would say that while it was part of the whole 20th century narrative because of famines and this kind of thing, it gained particular salience when India had this experience in the 1965-66 droughts, when Indira Gandhi had to go begging to Lyndon Johnson for the PL 480 wheat, and there was a tremendous political price extracted for that, and Mrs. Gandhi then determined never again. That's what launched the Green Revolution, and strengthened the whole elaborate network of minimum support price, public distribution, etc., that continues until today. Now, despite that substantial apparatus, and of course Sanjay knows much more about this on the ground, although we have been doing quite a bit of work on the PDS, both for kerosene and also for food grains, at the request of government. India is, as we discovered yesterday in the panel on inequality, the world champion on malnutrition, particularly child malnutrition. So whatever we have been doing has not been working, at least for one important category of, well, for the society as a whole, and particularly for malnourished children. And my understanding, I'm not a specialist, is that malnutrition in children is very much linked up with malnutrition in mothers as well. So the last thing I want to say, I'm not being complacent in the least. However, the story that many of us carried in our heads, and we do advise the Commerce Ministry on agricultural trade negotiations, was that India would gain from integration with the world economy, but that a number of things needed to happen, which I won't go into right now, because India, to use the language of economists, has a comparative advantage in agriculture, but there were a number of distortions, to use the economic term, as well as problems of rural infrastructure that made it, that were holding India back, in addition to the most important element, which is that agriculture in India is a state subject. It's really not a central subject. So basically the old mantra was gradually reduce external barriers, allow domestic prices to get aligned with market prices, shift public expenditure away from subsidies towards infrastructure, and facilitate internal trade, particularly in food grains, which has been balkanized by various state level restrictions. Okay, so all of that was part of a narrative that said that, look, economically India could gain and would gain through greater specialization, and particularly because our land-man ratio is so adverse, what we ought to be doing is moving through trade to higher valued crops, horticultural crops, animal husbandry, etc., a bit like Operation Flood and the Milk Revolution, and we should feel comfortable in importing things where we don't have a comparative advantage, particularly cereals, at the margin from abroad. And then along came this huge spike, particularly in cereals, and to some extent also in edible oils. And so I think the question to debate is how shaken are we in an environment of, as I said, substantial malnutrition, notwithstanding mammoth government intervention and machinery, to keep relying on global trade to meet our needs. And here I would just briefly address the question you really put to me, which is that why did this happen and how scared should we be? Why, I would say that on the question of why it happened, it's all about spin management. The Indian view is it happened because, well, everybody agrees there was drought, particularly in Australia, which is an important wheat producer. What, from a policy point of view, we are very, if you like, ready to point to the shift of land, particularly in the US and to some extent EU, from food to fuel, as it were, biofuels, and that was important. As you know, President Bush in his wisdom decided that to tar the brush, or to explain it all in terms of rising consumption in India and China. Yep. So, you know, you pays your money and you takes your choice. Having said that, I'm old enough to remember a similar commodity scare in the 1970s, the Club of Rome, etc., following which commodity prices slumped to unprecedented levels. So in part what we are seeing is a restoration of the relative terms of trade, and that is, I would consider to be secular, and it's basically reflecting the fact that there is indeed increasing affluence, which I don't think is going to go away in India and China. But finally, agricultural markets globally and locally follow what economists call a cobweb cycle, that basically as relative prices change, people start adding land, they start shifting cropping patterns, and one reason we have such complicated agricultural policies is because all societies have found that they have to intervene, otherwise the dynamics of prices are too unstable for households who depend on them for their livelihoods. So I would say that I would make one final point before allowing you to move on to the other colleagues, which is that we are all committed for various reasons to smallholder production, agricultural production, but the reality is that in the now rich countries, agriculture employs 2% of the population at very high levels of productivity. And there are people who've been arguing, Paul Collier for example, even for Africa, that it is this romantic myth about smallholder production that's the real problem, that if we were to really permit truly commercial farming globally, including in India and in Africa, that there really would be no long-term supply issue.